Embassy of India in Brussels, a certain Mr. Lalit Mansingh, I remember him. So over the next 30 years, I met George Fernandes very frequently, both in Europe and in India. Sometimes he invited me to stay at his house, and when he was in Belgium, he stayed at my house. Now, the Janata Party was established to restore democracy, but there were irreconcilable differences, really, between the component parts, and it didn't last. One part went off to become the BJP, another part went off to become the Lokdal, and another part was the remnant of the Janata Party. The 2004 elections, the so-called Rajiv wave after Mrs. Gandhi's assassination, everybody did badly, and George lost his seat. He was out of Parliament. 2004, that was for the second time. But they managed to bring the Janata Party and the Lokdal Party together again, and George played a very prominent role in that, which became the Janata Dal. Thought of a good new name, Janata Dal. And with the help of VP Singh, they again won the elections in 1989, and George was minister again, this time responsible for the railways. And for a short time, he also had additional responsibility for Kashmir. This again was a fairly short-lived affair, and in the 1991 general election, the Congress Party got back under Narasimha Rao with Manmohan Singh as the finance minister. And then gradually the Janata Dal Party disintegrated. And George Fernandes then, under pressure from various sides, agreed that it was necessary to try to reconstitute a separate socialist party, and that was how it gave birth to the Janata Party. The Samatha Party. Samatha, Janata. There were two very short-lived United Front governments after that, one supported by Devi Gowda, led by Mr. Devi Gowda and supported by the Congress I, who didn't really like Mr. Devi Gowda, so they said he had to go. And he was replaced by Mr. Gujral, but he only lasted for another 6 months or so, and then fresh elections were held. Now, during this time, many other sections of what had been the original Janata Dal decided that they should ally themselves with the BJP. And in this election of 1998, the BJP won. It was not a very convincing victory, and another election had to be held the following year in 1999, and then you had a 5-year period of government. Now, George was then made defense minister. Mr. Yashwant Sinha was his colleague as finance minister initially, and then he swapped with Yashwant Singh to become external affairs minister. This was a very difficult period of confrontation with Pakistan. First, there was the Kargil crisis, and then this also confrontation after the bomb attack on the Indian Parliament building here in New Delhi. But it was really firmness, but conciliatory efforts which prevented the outbreak of a fourth war between India and Pakistan. At one point in the crisis, very interestingly, the Pakistan's government invited a delegation of the Indian Parliament to travel to Pakistan. And this was not a very popular idea with certain people, but the delegation went, they were well received, and it was another way of diffusing what was a very difficult situation. In the 2004 election, we know that the Congress got back, and although George Fernandes was re-elected for the 9th time to the Lok Sabha, it became obvious that his health had started to decline, and George had to fight the final battle of his life, which was one that he couldn't possibly win, the battle against ill health. Now, I need to say a little bit about George's beliefs. What were the main influences on George Fernandes' political thinking? First, Gandhiji. Second, J.P. Narayan. Third, Dr. Loya. I've listened to numerous speeches that George Fernandes gave, And he started off with J.P. Narayan, lawyer, and then he would begin the speech. But his basic tenets, am I right? His basic tenets were always what J.P. Narayan felt, what Dr. Lawyer felt. Dr. Lawyer unfortunately met with a rather untimely death very early on, and one of George Fernandes' great mentors thereafter was his friend Madhu Limaye, who has been a great historian of the Indian Socialist Party. If you wish to read and learn about the history of the Indian Socialist Party, there are some excellent books by Madhu Limaye. Freedom, Democracy After Freedom was one, and another one was Socialist-Communist Interaction, which was prepared under the guidance of George Matthew. Now, yesterday, His Holiness used the phrase, "We are all human beings." And no one with a conscience can accept to see their fellow human beings living in absolute poverty or deprived of their freedom and rights. The books to which Dr. George Matthew referred to yesterday, which were published at the time of George's 60th birthday, went under the general heading of Dignity for All. And this was the driving principle behind the life's work of George Fernandes. And he believed that only through a socialist approach could dignity for all be achieved. And as a democratic socialist, he believed that there can be no socialism without democracy. Indeed, this was the fundamental principle when the Socialist International was re-established in Frankfurt in 1951. First, he believed that India's terrible rural poverty, and I'm going back to when I first knew him at the beginning of the 1980s, was largely a question of lack of investment. Most of the villages had no clean drinking water, no electricity, no transport links, no schools, and no medical facilities, and also very few job opportunities. Thus, in all the governments in which he served, he pressed for a much greater emphasis to be made on rural development. The concomitant of rural poverty was the steady drift from the villages into the overcrowded cities. There, people, often with young children, had to live on the pavements or in the hutment areas with no proper sanitation, and from time to time the city authorities would come and bulldoze them down. This he opposed vigorously. He believed that not to have a job was to have no dignity. As industry minister, he was concerned that increasing domination by foreign companies could lead to big job losses. Together with the finance minister at the time, he obliged foreign companies to have local Indian partners. Now, some companies went along with this, but others didn't. And one in particular was the Coca-Cola company, which decided to pull out of India. Now, George then set up an Indian company which would only use indigenous products to make its cola drink. He called it 77 after the election, but all the people knew it as George Cola. As the railway minister, his great legacy was the building of the Konkan Railway, which runs all the way from Bombay via Goa to Mangalore. The British felt that this was an engineering impossibility, but nevertheless, George set it in motion, and some years later it was completed, a great triumph of Indian engineering. George supported technical innovation, where this would make railway operations more efficient, but not if it would lead to serious job losses. I remember he told me once that somebody had come to him to propose that the clay cups in which tea was served on the trains and on the platforms should be done away with and replaced by mass-produced plastic cups. He was against this idea. He said, look at all the people who will lose their jobs. And also, plastic is not environmentally friendly. I've nearly come to the end. As the defense minister, his preoccupation was to steer India through this crisis with Pakistan, which I've mentioned. And George was very popular with the armed forces. With the army, he visited the troops on the front line frequently, even staying with them in tents on the high mountains of the line of control in Kashmir. With the Air Force, he flew in the jet fighter planes with the pilots. In the Navy, he went underwater in the submarines. In my living room, I have a picture of him standing on the deck of an Indian destroyer in the middle of the ocean. He arrived there by helicopter in his kurta pajamas, sandals. There were 2 ships in company. He landed on the helicopter platform of the one ship. But there was the second ship, and the captain of the second ship said, could Mr. Fernandes, could the defense minister come and visit my ship too? Now, the only way to get from one ship to the other was by what we call bosun's chair. You have to throw a rope from the one ship to the other, and then you get in a sort of contraption of canvas and rope, and you'll hold across. You'll hold across about 100 foot of sea from one ship to the other, while these ships are going through the sea at about 30 knots. That's about 55 kilometers an hour. Man was 70 years old. I mean, I think that's a tribute to how he was quite prepared to be there with the soldiers, with the airmen, and with the sailors. Now, there is one part of George Fernandes' legacy which is missing. What he would have liked to have seen was that when he departed, and fortunately he's not yet departed, but he's not really able to be with us, he would have left behind a strong, united Indian Socialist Party. Unfortunately, that is not the case. Why is it not the case? First of all, I think because the Indian electoral system, like the American electoral system, is not friendly to small parties. Secondly, because as a result of the emergency, the Socialist Party was dissolved into the Janata Party and never really got to grips again. We have socialist strength in some parts of India, not at all in others, and I think it would be wonderful if in future a revived Socialist Party could come to be. This will be for the new generation. Now, I think it is wonderful that so many young people belong to or establish for themselves civil society organizations which play a wonderful job. But civil society organizations cannot replace political parties. Political decisions, which are the important ones, are taken by governments and by parliaments where it's the political parties that decide. Now, I would be very happy if everyone said, yes, great, I'll go and form the new Socialist Party, or I'll go and join the Socialist Party. That would be wonderful. But it is more important to decide to join a political party, to take part in the political process. If you happen to be a socialist, join the Socialist Party. If you don't, join another party, because democratic politics is about pluralism. It's not about one-party state. It's about pluralism. I worked in the European Parliament for 20 years. We have a real multi-party system. There's never been one party which has dominated. Fortunately, for the 20 years that I was there, our group was the largest group. It isn't anymore. But politics is about compromise and listening to the other person's point of view. I'm told my time is up, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. These were really informative words. And now I would